Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Today we are going to cover the last piece of chapter 8, lecture 3, software testing. We are going to finish more type of testing and see how all these are related to the testing phase. Well, test-driven development is a software development process or approach which relies on the repetition of a very short development cycle, which is in other words like increment. Requirements are turned into a very specific test cases. Then the code is improved so that the test passes all these requirements. Test-driven is an evolutionary approach to development which combines test-first development, where you write a test before you write before you finish the code, which is just to fulfill the test, and after that you do a refactoring. Test-driven development is an approach to programming development in which you interleave testing and code development. Interleave the test code. You code, then you test, you code, you test, which it is like an agile, and actually it is really part of agile method, this one. Tests are written before code, and passing the test is the critical driver of development. When you pass the test, then you go on to the next increment. You develop code incrementally along with a test so that with the test for that increment. You don't move on to the next increment until you finished or the test, all the test cases passes, in this increment. TDD was introduced as part of agile method, such as extreme programming. However, it can be used in a plan-driven development process. Well, if we look at this diagram, it looks like represent like the agile or the incremental one. We identify the new functionality. We write the test. We run the test, after we're writing the program. If it fails, then we implement functionality and refactor, change, do whatever, run the test until it passes. When it passes, you identify another functionality or another increment. Well, the activities, as we said in the previous slide, this really explained the diagram before. First of all, we start identifying the increment of functionality that's required. This should normally be small, very small, It's like, the agile or extreme programming, which it is really maximum couple of weeks. Write a test for this functionality and implement this as an automated test. Why? Because you want to do regression testing. Because when next increment, we have to test or to do the test cases for the first and the second increment. Run the test along with all other tests that have been implemented. Regression testing. Initially, you have not implemented the functionality so that new test will fail. Implement the functional and run or rerun the test. Once all tests are successfully done, you move on to next increment to get the next chunk of functionality. Well, as we said, everybody, whoever, come up with an idea, they always promote that idea through some benefit, what's really the benefit one. And sometimes really like they exaggerate, or I think it's a good idea, some benefit with this test-driven. First of all, code coverage. Every code segment that you write has at least one associated test. So all code written has at least one test. Why? Because it's very small increment. You go through it thoroughly and you test it. Regression testing, this means that regression testing suite is developed incrementally as a program is developed. You repeat the test again and again and again for every increment we have. Like for increment 1, we do the test. We go to increment 2, we do the test for increment 1 and 2. You go to 3, then you do 1, 2, 3, and so on. Simplified debugging. Of course, when you have a small, system or a small increment, I think it's easy to debug it. When a test fails, it should be obvious where the problem lies. When you have a problem with the test, you could figure it out because the increment is so small. And that's, one advantage of the incremental actually. System documentation, I don't know about that, The tests themselves are a form of documentation that describe what the code should be doing. Of course, if you do a lot of test cases and those are documented, they are part of the document, this means probably it could help or it could really replace or it could substitute really the system documentation. Regression testing, actually, it is a type of software testing to confirm that the recent program change has not affected the existing feature of that program. It's nothing but a full or a partial selection of already executed test cases which are executed to ensure existing functionality working fine. In other words, the new change we've done to that system, it doesn't screw up the previous part of it. So we do the test cases of the previous increment and the current increment. Regression testing is testing the system to check that changes have not broken previously worked code. Again, it's the same. In a manual testing process, regression testing is expensive. Why? Why expensive? Because it is repetition. We repeat the test case again and again and again for how many increment we have. So since it is really expensive, probably it is a good idea to automate the testing process. It is simple and straightforward. All tests are rerun every time a change is made to the program. Test must run successfully before the change is committed. Release testing. Release testing, it's like testing a new version of the software. So if it is a project or product or whatever, to verify then the software can be released to the market. Release testing has a broad focus since the entire functionality of the release is really under test. So it's a broad focus, not really a detailed one, because the detailed one we test it in unit testing, etc. The test included in release testing is strongly dependent on the software itself, not anything else. Release testing is the process of testing a particular release of a system that is intended for use outside the development team. We develop the program or the software. Now we're gonna release it. We're gonna install it. It's gonna go to the production environment. So this is really the last type of test we have to do before we release it and give it to the customer. The primary goal of the release testing process is to convince the supplier of the system that it is good enough for use. Release testing therefore has to show that the system delivers its specified functionality, performance, dependability, and that it does not fail during normal use. Release testing is usually a black box testing process where tests are only derived from the system specification. It's a black box testing. You look at not really in detail. Usually it's done with the customer and with somebody who has no idea about the system, just to make sure that the system is working according to specification. So far we talk about a lot of testing: unit testing, component testing, system testing, release testing, use case testing, regression testing, whatever. All these tests again and again and again, we always talk about them. There are 3 stages of the test. We have a unit testing, we have integration testing, unit and unit, module and module, subsystem and subsystem, until we get, to the system testing. Then we test the whole system when all components are now working together to see, and usually in the system testing, we check for non-functional requirement, and then user acceptance testing. Really, these are the stages that the name of regression testing, whatever, those, they are a good type of testing. Test comes under the umbrella of these 3 stages. Release testing is a form of system testing. So don't confuse yourself, when you talk about system testing. When the system, all components together, now we do the system testing for the emergent properties like non-functional requirement, whatever. In the meantime, we'll find out that the system is ready for use, and we are going to release it. The difference, a little difference, or not really a difference, a separate team that has not been involved in the system development should be responsible for release testing. Because sometimes in probably the system testing, probably we could do some of it like a white box testing. So we have to have another team, but nothing wrong if the same team, if we cannot afford to have another team to do the release testing, it could be done by the same team in both system testing and release testing, because actually we said release testing is part of the system testing. System testing by the development team should focus on discovering bugs in the system. See, that's why we could talk about that detailed thing, the defect testing. It's like the unit testing, whatever. The objective of release testing is to check that the system meets its requirement and is good enough for external use, which it is validation testing. Again and again and again, we're talking about different type of testing, and we don't want to repeat the same thing, for unit testing, integration testing, system testing, and user acceptance testing. The stages are now. Probably it's a way how really to test something by requirement. Requirement-based testing involves examining each requirement and developing a test case or test for it, either a test or many tests. And that's actually what happened. In the time when we collect requirement early in the development process, that's the time, when we look at an important requirement. Sometimes a good customer, we could really, say, well, we're going to test this requirement. And we are going to use the customer here or the user really as a tester or evaluator later on. An example here, mental health care patient management system requirement. If a patient is known to be allergic to any particular medication, then prescription of the medication shall result in warning message. Well, we say, it's probably this is a good test case to test it. So we could really set up a patient who has an allergy to some kind of medication, and then we try really to give him this medication to see if really the system give him that message or that warning. If a prescriber chooses to ignore an allergy warning, they shall provide a reason why this has been ignored. So the system give him the warning, but if you want to override it, so you could really give a reason why you give him this medication, even that the patient really is allergic to this type of medication. How are we going to test that? We could set up a patient record with no known allergy, prescribe medication for allergy that are known to exist, check that warning message is not issued by the system. Set up patient record with known allergy. We could really mention that, this patient is allergic to this. Prescribe a medication that the patient is allergic to and check that warning. Set up a patient record in which allergies or 2 or more drugs are recorded. Prescribe both of these drugs separately and check that. Describe 2 drugs that the patient is allergic to and check that 2 warnings again. Prescribe a drug that issue a warning and overrule this warning. issue a warning and then you overrule it by some remark, or why really you prescribe this drug for that, even the patient is allergic to this kind of medication. Well, if you want to test by scenario, first of all, authentication by logging onto the system to see if the user allowed to get into the system, downloading and uploading of specified patient record to a laptop, home visit scheduling, encryption and decryption of patient record on a mobile device, record retrieval and modification, link with the drug database that maintain a side effect, and the system for call prompting or whatever it is. This feature طبعا this is tested by a scenario from A to Z with that scenario. Well, this is here a scenario, we don't have really to read it all, but I mean it's a scenario for mental health care patient management system. They're saying here Kate is a nurse who specializes in mental health care. One of her responsibilities is to visit patients at home to check that their treatment is effective and that they are not suffering from medication side effects. Saying one day for home visit, Kate logs onto the mental health care patient management system and uses its print her schedule for home visit for that day, along with the summary information about the patient to be visited. She requests that the record for this patient be downloaded to her laptop. She is prompted for her key phrase to encrypt the record in the laptop, whatever. It is really a scenario to cover, the previous slide we were talking about. Performance testing, it's a process of determining speed, responsiveness, stability of the computer, network, software program, or device we're working on. It's actually part of the release testing. May involve testing the emergent properties of a system such as performance and reliability. Test should reflect the profile of use of that system. Performance tests usually involve planning a series of tests where the load is steadily increased until the system performance becomes unacceptable. See, that's why when the performance, probably in the test environment, while we're testing the program, we see that the system is very, very fast. Why? Because the database, the load, it is not really that heavy. First of all, a couple of people working on the system, and the database, it's not really loaded with a lot of records, a few hundred records or so. But in the production environment, probably you deal with a few hundred users working on the system at once, and you deal with many different databases with millions of records. So that's why performance will suffer probably later on. So we have to test it now. So we have probably to build an environment very close to the production environment to see how really the system act, in this situation. Stress testing is a form of performance testing where the system is deliberately overloaded to test its failure behavior. We stress the system. We let hundreds of people working on the system at once, sending the same information to see if it is really have really probably a problem with a deadlock, or see how really the system act when it is overloaded of a lot of test cases. User testing or user acceptance testing. User acceptance testing, which is UAT, is the last phase of the software testing process. During UAT, actual software user test the software to make sure it can handle required tasks in the real world scenario, in the real environment, in production environment. And actually it has more functionality if there is a defect or whatever. We talk about the unit when we talk about the unit testing, we said we don't have to wait, for to find out if there is a defect or there is a problem with the calculation, if there is a problem in the unit testing. We don't have to wait for the user acceptance testing to wait until now, which it is the last stage, and then we bring the user. Actually, we bring the user as part of the user acceptance testing in the unit testing. When we test all the test cases there, probably we bring him, he could really find out if there is a problem in the specification, if there is. And when we talk about verification and validation, if you remember, verification, we said it is run the program against specification, but validation run the program against the requirement. So we don't need really the unit testing to be just verification. We need to have it as a verification and validation in the same time. So part of the user acceptance testing probably we do at that time. The final touch, the final thing, the final piece probably of testing, it is the user acceptance testing, just to look at the final touch of that system. User or customer testing is a stage in the system, in the testing process, in which user or customer provide input and advice and system testing. User testing is essential even when comprehensive system and release testing have been carried out. The reason for this is that influences from the user working environment have a major effect in the reliability, performance, usability, and robustness of a system. These cannot be replicated in a test environment. That's what really we're saying. We're saying we cannot really replicate, but we have to sometimes probably have a test environment look like the production environment, and the user who really put it, who did that test cases. Sometimes we could do it in a different way, as we are going to see in the next slide. Okay. Type of user testing, as we said, we have three types, or we divide it to like a three stages. Or alpha testing, which it is the one, as we said, in the component testing we do it. User of the software work with the development team to test the software at the developer site. So it is a type of software testing performed to identify bugs before releasing the product to a real user or to the public. And actually it is done in the development. Beta is performed by clients who are not part of the organization. Beta release the software to a specific client or a user to allow them to experiment and to raise problems that they discover with the system developers. So we'll release it not to the whole world, but we release it to a few clients. They test it in their environment, but actually in production environment. Alpha testing is performed at developer site, but beta is performed with the end user site. When we're done with the alpha and beta and everything is okay, then we release the rest of the system or the whole system to everybody in acceptance testing. Acceptance testing, customer tests a system to decide whether or not it is ready to be accepted from the system developer and deployed in the customer environment, primary for custom system, which it is now. It's the final release and we send it to everybody. Well, there is a process for acceptance testing. It goes through many different phases or activities, whatever. We define the acceptance criteria. We have it there, the test criteria. Plan the acceptance testing. We put it in a test plan. We derive acceptance test, what really test we are going, to have it from that plan. And then we run the acceptance test. Then we negotiate the result of the test, acceptable, it's not acceptable, changing, whatever it is. And either we accept or reject the system. If we accept it, we install it. Otherwise, we have to change something to it and do it again and again and again until we reach an agreement. Well, stages of acceptance testing, as we saw it in the diagram, first of all, we define the acceptance criteria. A definition of the criteria actually early in the process, when we collect requirement and what's really the criteria which it's really make that requirement pass or doesn't pass with them. We plan it. We have a plan for acceptance testing to create the test cases, etc. Then we derive the acceptance test. We derive it, and we create the test cases in the design, in the analysis and design phases. We run it, all these tests, and through the implementation phase, and we negotiate again during the implementation phase. But we go through many different, as we said, in the unit testing, integration testing, system testing, all these kind of things. The customer is there, and the end result, it is either reject or accept, but not really in the last step. If there is a rejection, if there is an objection, and the result, I think we could change it in the unit testing. We change the program, and finally, I think we have to reach an agreement at the end to accept the system. Well, if you remember, when we talk about Agile in chapter 3, we said one, advantage of it, that the customer is really part of the team, and there is no way he could really reject that system later on, because he is part of the team. We develop the program. When he's there, we test it. Because why? Because the development and testing all comes in one stage. They are interlinked. In Agile method, the user customer is part of the development team and is responsible for making decision and the acceptability of the system. In other words, when we do an increment, we don't go to the next increment until the customer give his okay on it. We will go to the second increment and on until we finish the system. So there is no way he could come at the end and reject that system. Tests are defined by the user customer and are integrated with other tests, and that they are run automatically when changes are made to this increment. So it is regression testing, we said. There is no separate acceptance testing process. So there is no really acceptance test, It don't come really at the end and said, well, come on, you accept it or not, because actually he accepted partially, piece by piece by piece. When we release the first increment, this means he did accept it. The second, the third, the fourth, and so on. Main problem here is whether or not the embedded user is typical and can represent the interests of all system stakeholders. The problem, as we said in Agile, if we have a customer with us, he developed that with us, he is there, he accepts all the increments, he has his or her okay on him, and when we release the whole system, we find another stakeholder, another customer reject that, because the person who was with us while we are developing the system does not represent really the whole team there. That is one of the problem, as we mentioned back in chapter 3 in Agile. Well, by now we finished really the testing, and we see many different types of testing. And again, we emphasize the importance of the 3 stages or 4 stages we talk about, which it is the unit testing, represent the program, the component, they call it component testing. Then integration testing, unit and unit, module and module, subsystem and subsystem. Those we integrate them together, we build them together, we test them together until we get the whole system. Then we test the whole system testing, to check for some type of requirement, like non-functional requirement, the emergent properties of the system, and then after that, user acceptance testing. But again, we talk about regression testing, user testing, requirement testing, scenario, black box testing, white box testing, all these kind of type of testing. I believe we have to understand each of these, what is the definition of it, where it's used. But actually the stages is those really 4 stages, the one we talk about in in the testing. So very important to understand this, because we need probably to answer some question to match the definition with the key term, and we have to find out all these type of testing, what are those, and probably they are part of that stage or that stage. Finally, the key points, what really we cover in this chapter: testing can only show the presence of errors in a program. It cannot demonstrate that there are no remaining faults. Development testing is the responsibility of the software development team. A separate team should be responsible for testing system before it's released. So, unit testing is really the person who wrote the program. They are a separate group who really do the test. Development testing include unit testing, in which you test individual object and method. Component testing, in which you test related group of object, composite of program or object or classes, whatever. And system testing, in which you test partial or complete system. When testing software, you should try to break the software, like exhaustive testing, by using experience and guidelines to choose type of test case that have been effective in discovering defect in other system. All this depends, on your experience. Whenever possible, you should write automate test. The tests are embedded in a program that can be run every time a change is made to the system, especially in the incremental. When we say increment after increment after increment. Test-first development is an approach to development where tests are written before the code to be tested. We write the test cases before even we write the code. And actually, this is probably what happened, if really we want to do it right. While we collect the requirement, we say, well, this is a test case we are going to test. And probably we plug it in, we write the test case, and then later on, after we write the program, we have the test case ready to be tested. Scenario testing involves inventing a typical usage scenario and using this to derive test cases. Probably we could really go to a scenario from A to Z and really derive from it some test cases. Acceptance testing is a user testing process where the aim is to decide if the software is good enough to be deployed and used in its operational environment. And it is really the last stage, the acceptance testing, before we release the program or the system to the customer. And as we said, acceptance testing, will precede probably the beta testing, and before the beta is the alpha testing. Alpha testing, where the user test the system in the developer site, but the beta testing, we test it in a production environment in the client site. Acceptance testing, it's the final thing when just before we release the system. By this we finish, chapter 8, which it is really the system testing. The only thing left is the evaluation, which it is chapter 9. We probably will go over it in a lecture or 2 maximum. Bye.